It's my pleasure to bring to our stage our youth panelist, whose discussion will be moderated by Carolyn, Yvellez, a former South Bay City Council of Government Civic Spark Fellow who now works for Farallon Strategies. It is great to have Carolyn back since she did some very important work for the COG. When she was here fashioning the city's vulnerability assessments and creating the South Bay Adaptation Plan. Hi, Carolyn, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. I don't think we have any.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, for staying awake after lunch. I know I'm a little sleepy, but we saved the youth panel and all our energy for last to keep you with us, so feel free to refill on some coffee. But how about that for an energy vision, energy future? Love it. Love to see it. So my name is Carolyn Yvellez. Like I was introduced, I'm a project and strategy lead with Farallon Strategies, which is a firm that actually does a lot of technical assistance for Strategic Growth Council grants. I'm looking forward to talking more about resilience centers with some of you after this session. But really thrilled to be here with this panel of soon-to-be experts of how to lead us in the next generation to building resilient communities. So I want to first go around the room, around our panel, and just do a quick introduction. If you can provide just your name, where you go to school, if you're enrolled in a program, what program that is, and why you're here. What makes you an environmental advocate, an environmentalist? What motivates you to do the work that you do? Or, what are your interests? So go ahead. I think you have your mic right there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Veronica Fish, and I'm a junior at Mira, Costa High School. And I'm most interested in the intersection of technology, health, and the environment. So the reason why I'm motivated for climate action is because I really care about the health and the well-being of my community. And at the end of the day, climate change is so much more than just rising temperatures. It directly impacts our health in so many ways. You have pollution, you have overheating, and then also the release of viruses and fungi from melting ice caps, and higher survival rates for viruses and fungi in areas that they were not able to survive before, again, because of rising temperatures. And these issues are really important to me as somebody who cares about health above all other things, so that's why I'm here today to talk to you guys.
Hello, my name is Gabriella Fish, and I am also a junior at Mira Costa. And I'm here today because I'm very much interested in learning as much as I can from the environment. I come from a very environmentally conscious family, and being very environmentally conscious has been a big part of my life, and I feel like many people don't understand that even this small list of changes can make a large impact on the environment, and I feel like that was very much highlighted today. And so yeah, I want to spread the word.
Hi, I'm Kina Desai, and I'm an 11th grader at Mira Costa High School as well. I live in Hermosa Beach. The thing that's inspired me most to pursue climate action and has really grown my passion in climate change and climate resiliency is that it's a problem that faces everyone. In a world where there's a lot of things that divide us, there's a lot of polarization within our own country, the one thing that we all have in common is that we live on this earth, and I think it's really important that we use climate action and resiliency as something that brings us together, and it's something that we can all benefit from on a larger scale. And I feel like, especially here in the US, where we have access to so much new technology, we have access to making advancements, we're in a post-industrial economy, I feel it's very important that we start to take leadership on a global scale in implementing climate sustainability and resiliency projects, because this is going to be what every country in the world is going to need to follow, and we have the access to do that here.
Hi everyone, my name is Alden Lundy. I grew up in the South Bay, and I just graduated from Loyola Marymount before I did the Coro Fellowship in Public Affairs, and I'm currently doing my first job ever working for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on offshore wind leasing. I remember that when I was in high school, I took an environmental science class, and kind of freaked out. I'm sure other people had that feeling when they realized the immense stage that we are facing and the problems that are going to affect everyone across this planet. So very happy to be here, very happy to hear so many passionate people speaking on ways to address these challenges.
Hi, my name is Bailey Wong. I'm a resident native of Redondo Beach, and I am also a student at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm in the Urban and Regional Planning program, and my emphasis is community development and social justice. So the reason I'm interested in environmentalism is, like it was said earlier, the effects of climate change affect people who are low income, people of color, and indigenous native communities more than other well-off, wealthier communities. So I kind of take a more equitable standpoint in looking at the effects of climate change and how they impact other people and climate change, or how they impact other people more than more well-off groups.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here. I'm already more motivated and hopeful for our future. So I'll start off with the first question. So you already touched a little bit on this, but what concerns you most about climate change? And how does climate change show up in your daily lives, in your conversations with friends, peers, teachers? What does climate change mean to you right now? Go ahead.
Something that I think is very important to talk about when it comes to climate change is what is the nature of the conversations among young people relating to climate change. And to be frank, it's very pessimistic. So many of my peers feel like our future is hopeless. We have no future. It's too late to go back on decades and decades of damage. And I think that it's so important that we turn that conversation around, that we focus on areas where we're currently making improvement and areas where we will start to see improvement. Because for so many of my peers, constantly hearing just so much, like an onslaught of really depressing information is so demotivating for so many people. I don't know how many conversations I've had that have ended with, well, there's no point even trying because we're all gonna die anyway because of the environment. So again, it's really very critical that we start to uplift this, have more uplifting discussions where we're not immediately shooting down our future or just tossing it off to the next generation.
I think adding to what my sister said, much like what Jean Rodriguez said, we are told, I think it started when I was in 6th grade, we've been told, you are the future, you guys are the ones who are supposed to fix this problem that we have caused. And hearing, hearing like all the demotivating things going on with the planet and how the planet is basically already destroyed, and just leaving and feeling like you are responsible for fixing those problems is extremely demotivating. We see our problems with like pollution, like the drought, storms in all parts of the country, and even diseases when it comes to climate change is forcing animals out of their environment, and it's making more people and animal interactions, and that spreads diseases, which could also be a potential problem in the future. And I feel like the youth needs to be more aware of the positive aspects as well as aware of all the aspects, if that makes any sense.
I agree. I definitely agree with what was said before. And I think going off of that is not only recognizing that there can be a positive outcome to this problem if we start to take action, but recognizing that we need to start taking action and it's a problem. Because I feel that, yes, people know the buzzwords, climate change is a problem, we need to lower our carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, that's a problem. But knowing the actual problem and understanding how does this become a problem. For example, ocean acidification. I think one of the speakers talked about how rising levels of carbon dioxide causes more acid in the ocean, and then that's harmful to organisms living there, which we eat and depend on for food sources. So understanding the actual problem so that we can start to take action is something I feel like is very important. And it is somewhat concerning if, all we talk about are the buzzwords and what we hear in the mainstream media or on social media, but without really understanding the problem. And I think the second thing that is sometimes somewhat concerning and kind of ties to that is that a lot of the emissions or a lot of the things that contribute to climate change are things that the public doesn't see in their everyday lives. Like, for example, earlier today we were talking about water use, and agriculture in the US accounts for about 80% of consumptive US water use, and that's a lot of water use that people don't see, but it's in our everyday lives, it's in what we eat. And so if people become more aware of this, I think it's really important and crucial, the importance of eating lower on the food chain because of these impacts that we don't see in our everyday lives, but are still present and a large contributor.
I have to say, completely agree with everything that's been said so far. It's fairly daunting to look at societal issues that have been built up over generations and will take generations to solve. But societal issues require entire societal change, and that always starts with individuals. So we've heard some aspects today of giving people jobs and training tracks to be able to get real world options and opportunities to be able to address these problems, and that really empowers them economically and just how they feel. They feel like they can make a difference by having access to things like that.
Like everyone else said, I would agree with all of them. But I think that our generation has taken a very pessimistic view on climate change, personally because of the media consumption we have. Like one of my colleagues said, the buzzwords are very triggering to a lot of us. And seeing that and then seeing all the statistics and information that is easily provided to us on our cell phones, we are somewhat aware of what is happening and the negative impacts it could have on our future lives. So we're not super hopeful, but we're willing to change and adapt to what needs to be done to make for us a better future.
Thank you so much. And I'll chime in because I consider myself part of this youth panel as well, even though I just talked to Aaron who welcomed me back to the COG and said, oh, look, you grew up. It's like, I'm still part of the youth panel. It's like sitting at Thanksgiving with like the kids table, like I'm still here. But I'll also add, just in terms of how climate change shows up in my life, I used to be part of a divestment campaign in college, and how it showed up this week, it looks a lot different than protesting. It looks like shoveling buckets of water outside of my house trying to prevent it from flooding this week. Does anyone else have that problem in the South Bay? I'm in San Diego, but it's a new normal in Southern California where I had no idea. I grew up in that house my entire life. I've never had to wake up at 2 in the morning to shovel buckets of water to prevent my house from flooding. So that's how climate change is impacting me today. So one more time around the room, we can combine some questions here, but what do you think is missing from the climate movement, or who might be missing from the climate movement? I mean, we're here, the youth is being represented today, but in general, do you feel like your voice as your generation is being seen in this space and in building momentum for a vision forward?
So for sure, I think that two very important issues that we need to talk about. I'm going to touch on two of them. One of them is I think we have a culture of overconsumption in this country that unless we tackle that, we will not make change regarding the climate. So we have, because we want to produce so much, we're so focused on production and overproduction and overconsumption. Unless we significantly cut back on our use of fossil fuels, we won't be able to move towards sustainable energy efforts. Now, my second thing that I want to talk about is I think it's important to combat the culture of indifference that we have in this country regarding climate change, right? It seems like such an insurmountable issue, such a huge problem that we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to acknowledge it, and we want to just push it off and procrastinate any kind of improvement. So I think we can all agree that a really frustrating discussion that always comes up in conversations of climate change is the financial one, right? How are we going to pay for these changes? How are we going to redesign and reinvent the grid in the South Bay? How are we going to invest all this money into renewable energy sources? And that's a really frustrating conversation because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. We have to do it. It's something that must happen, and any conversation about paying for it, any kind of, like I'm saying, procrastinating conversations, they have to stop because this is a challenge that we are facing not just tomorrow, not just several years from now, but we're facing this right now.
I think another thing, just to add to that, would be we hear we get talked to a lot about climate change, but like in general, it seems like the population itself doesn't seem to take much action. It was very nice to see like the panels today that a lot of action is being taken and things are improving, but as a population as a whole, the average person who doesn't care as much doesn't do much to help for the environment, and I feel like it needs to be very much reinforced and emphasized that little changes, in fact, do make an impact, and that everyone should help, not only the people who are truly passionate about it.
Yeah, individual action in addition to systems change. Yeah, absolutely.
I think I agree with what both was said before me, but I think the biggest thing that needs to change in the public and what's missing is widespread shift in how we think about energy, water use, how we live our daily lives, because it doesn't even need to be this one massive, abrupt shift, but if we gradually start to shift over to electric vehicles, which we are seeing, like California has the goal of not selling new fuel-based car in the future, and that's great progress, but in every aspect of life, we use energy and we use water, and people, we need to be able to start thinking about, shift how we think about these things, and how it's a finite resource, what we're doing when we turn on our light switch, when we, water our lawns unnecessarily. We are using up a resource, we are harming our planet, so shifting the mindset and the thinking around energy consumption and energy use is something that I think is missing, and I think that starts with educating people. So it was great to hear the panelists here talk about, the workforce, educating K through 12, because I think that's a really big part of it. Going through the school system right now, like, yes, we hear about climate change. You can choose in high school to take an environmental science class, but it's not something that is widespread and taught to the wide majority of people. And for this problem to really change, yes, we need action from people in the government, higher up in organizations and companies, but it needs to start with the widespread public shifting how we view our energy use and our water use, because at the end of the day, it comes down to, what are people buying, what are people using, and so people need to start investing in solar energy, investing in cars that are electric, or hydrogen cell cars in the future, so.
I completely agree, again. But I have to say that going forwards, we need to be able to embrace bold, and we need to be able to embrace crazy. Because if we were to restart today and somebody pitched putting our entire society on fossil fuels, knowing what happened and what has happened to our climate, nobody would go for it. So we need to think about what crazy idea we can do now to change what our future is going to look like. Growing up in the South Bay, we're all next to one of the major ports in the Western Hemisphere. If we look at that, the people that have been disproportionately affected by emissions from the ports are usually from lower income communities. If we're to look at something like that, we need to plan on how we can electrify that entire port, how we can move forward as a society so that we can save and help the communities that are already being burdened by our power, fossil fuel, and electrical system.
Okay, so when we talk about climate change, it's a multifaceted issue, and everyone in this room is very educated about it and passionate about it and creating a change, but we need to portray that to the average person. So when Lomita was talking about having the one kid who enjoyed the water plant like Disneyland, that's an extremely rare occurrence. So making sure that other people, regular people, are as passionate about climate change as we are, and educating other people is probably one of the main aspects that we need to work on as a community, as a South Bay, as a country.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yes, and I will say that the COG is one of those organizations that does embrace new, bold ideas. I remember resilience hubs being something that we talked about when I was a Civic Spark Fellow 5 years ago, and now the Strategic Growth Council has an entire grant program dedicated to it. So really exciting stuff. So reflecting on what you heard today, what did you find most interesting, exciting? What made you most hopeful? And Bailey, actually, let's go this way around, just so we have a little bit. You don't have to say, and I agree with everyone else. They can all agree with you.
Well, I always agree with you guys. I think the most interesting thing to me was definitely the green hydrogen. When I was talking to Janice, I asked her a question. But I also think that the microgrids was really interesting, having a individual grid specifically for a block, and if it wouldn't necessarily affect the entire grid system as a whole if we were to like have it freeze over or something. That was particularly interesting to me, and yeah.
I have to say that the microgrid idea is an important factor of how we move forwards in times where the grid goes down or there's power outages. We're the youth, but disproportionately the elderly die in those situations, and allowing them access to microgrids and community centers that are safely and environmentally powered is going to be very important to making sure that we protect our entire society.
Yeah, I definitely thought the microgrid was super interesting and a very exciting thing, and I know it was mentioned that it's not being implemented yet, so I think it's really important that we start to take steps to pushing that towards implementation. And then something else I found really interesting was by the grid project with the solar panels, and how not only is that reaching low-income families who are disproportionately sometimes affected by climate change, but also left out of the conversation as a whole, even though it affects them all the same, if not worse. And so I think that's a really big part of it. And on the second hand, also how the job training, and we're hitting multiple aspects of the climate change issue through that one project. And I think that's really awesome and really exciting, because not only is that something that's going to bring change right now, you know, building the solar panels now, but it's educating more people to come, and is something that can be sustainable and a continued project for years and generations to come.
I think another thing that was like brought up today that I found really interesting was the water recycling portion of this presentation. I honestly think it was
how well you
brilliant,
did today.
And it was. I've been told all my life, and we all know this, that California is in a major drought, and knowing that there are like 250 billion gallons of potential recycled water that are able to be used is a very positive thing for the future, and I'm very excited about it.
You stole the words right out of my mouth. I'm really excited about the water recycling portion of today's presentation, specifically groundwater replenishment. And honestly, it made me so proud to hear that there's so much effort going into water conservation and water recycling, because it's such a major concern, specifically in the South Bay, when we have all these droughts and all these water crises that we're confronted with every few years. So I'm also really excited about that portion of the presentation, because the new technologies that are emerging in terms of water purification and desalination efforts have always been really interesting to me, and I'm so excited for the future too, to see what kind of new technologies emerge regarding water recycling. So.
Yes, stewards. Yeah, and I'll add to that. Definitely was thinking as I was bucketing water out of my sunroom this week how I would really love a rain barrel from the South Bay Cogs distribution. So that was great to hear. That, and you know, I think that the energy panel did a great job of presenting really like what our generation would love to see out of an energy future. Some of the regulatory barriers to distributed energy systems and distributed energy resources is something I think that the youth can really help with. That's advocacy. That's challenging the existing systems and models of, you know, investor-owned utilities and a centralized grid, and what does it mean for community-owned solar and community co-ops to exist when the regulatory environment does not exist for them to, you know, exist successfully in this environment. So really happy to see that be elevated in today's discussion. So yeah, what aspect of future availability of resources was not included in today's discussion that deserves attention? Or what other areas? We talked really, it was water, energy, any other kind of future resources that we need to be focusing on maybe for the next COG events? Go ahead, Bailey.
So with the recent rain, I know the LA River is cemented up. I'm very concerned about how much water we're getting from the Colorado River and NorCal. It's about 50% right now. So I'm wondering how we can change our ways and have stormwater, wastewater, instead of going to the ocean, come and go to the groundwater supplier, West Basin with desalination or stuff like that. That's my biggest concern going forward with climate change.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I'm currently working for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on offshore wind, and that would be a large industry to come to what would be the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Long Beach. These are things that we need to be telling people about because it's something that you have to vote for, something that you have to tell your elected officials that you're in favor of, because that will directly translate to jobs, training programs in local communities to the South Bay.
Great. Yes, that education piece is huge.
Yeah, just to add in, something else I think that's really important part of this is the other ecosystems and organisms that are impacted by human activity, how we choose to interact with our environment, and not only like preserving biodiversity is a big part of when we add into the water conservation effort or, you know, reducing greenhouse gases, preserving habitats, because that organisms also and the biodiversity of the ecosystems also provide a lot of important functions that we can utilize to benefit the environment. And something I really liked about a lot of the speakers today was how they talked about utilizing infrastructure or utilizing things that we are already doing and improving upon them to increase the efficiency or conservancy of our energy or water use. And I think we can do the same thing with the environment. For example, wetlands, they naturally filter water, and that's something that, yes, it's not at the rate that a plant would be doing it, but it's something that we should keep in mind when we're talking about, you know, climate change and conserving our resources. It's also crucial that we conserve our environment and ecosystems and biodiversity, because right now in California alone, our state has lost over 90% of our wetlands, for example. That's just one example, so I think that's also another really important part of the discussion.
Yeah, nature-based solutions. That's something that we're seeing a lot of more in investment from federal and state levels.
Another thing I think people should focus on are how PFAs are affecting water. I would like to speak to the water group later about this, but I believe the Environmental Production Agency said this on Tuesday, that they need to begin regulating PFAS in our drinking water because it can cause serious health risks, including cancer. And I want to make sure that people focus on that, especially since regulations usually take about 3 years to become be in action, and many people who aren't aware of this problem, such as more disadvantaged communities, can seriously be affected by this, and their health can seriously be affected.
I'd like to touch on two things that I think are really important that we also need to add to this discussion of climate action. One of them is food insecurity. I think that was lightly touched on in this in the following presentations, and this idea of food deserts. So regions in Southern California that have no access to fresh food, to nutrient-rich food and nutritious food, and have to rely on cheap, not nutritious, and just poor quality food in order to survive. I think that transporting good food to these areas is so important. That takes a lot of energy, and it's something that requires a lot more attention because it's so often overlooked. And something else that I think is very important to reintroduce into the climate conversation is the emergence of new diseases that we previously haven't had to deal with. I think we're all very familiar with the effect of a global pandemic at this point, and let's be real, it's only going to keep happening if we don't actively fight rising temperatures. With melting ice caps in the north, it's releasing so many viruses and fungi that were previously frozen in, and with rising temperatures, these fungi are able to survive in regions that they were never able to survive before. Gabriella touched on this earlier about how animals that are moving into other areas due to changing temperatures are bringing their diseases with them, and they're coming into contact with humans, and that's spreading these diseases. We're only going to see more instances of diseases like COVID-19 or the monkeypox or other diseases, and it's just it'll just keep introducing new public health emergencies that affect the world on such an enormous scale like we've seen with COVID-19.
So David, I think, has his agenda for the next COG. I think we've just written it. Speaking of public health, I think discussion of air quality, and I was surprised I did not hear as much of this discussion. Farallon Strategies also staff at the Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network, and the historic wildfire seasons that we're seeing year and year again is impacting, all of Californians' ability to breathe, especially outdoor workers. Indoor air quality is a huge concern, and I'm really excited about local government and CBO partnerships that help distribute air purifiers and resources to communities, especially low-income households that are dealing with the impacts of poor air quality and the public health crisis that it poses. So a couple more questions as we're wrapping up. So what actions would you like to see local governments take to reduce carbon emissions or build more resilient communities? If you could direct all the local government staff and agencies in the room of what you'd like to see in the next year, what actions that were either presented today or outside of today's presentations would you like to see implemented at a local government scale? Bailey, do you want to start?
So today we talked a lot about the effects of transportation with the GHGs and stuff like that. And we kind of looked into hydrogen fuel and stuff like that, which could power cars. But I think instead of having private vehicles, we should focus more on public transportation or mass things that can get a mass amount of people into transportation versus just a singular car, which max has like 7 seats. I think that maybe that would help our GHG emissions. Also looking at the renewable sources, energy sources, like we talked about hydrogen, electricity, solar, stuff like that. But I honestly don't think that private vehicles are the solution.
To start with, it always comes down to funding, because these things are going to be very expensive, and I like to put it into perspective that electric vehicles are competing with oil and gas, which has been subsidized by the government since the days of Standard Oil. So it's one of the most heavily subsidized industries that still exists today, and that means that you need to take on your own the way to go get funding so that people can put solar on their homes. They can get batteries to store that can go back into the grid later when the sun has gone down. You need to think about each individual city trying to electrify your city fleets. Every single one of those vehicles you use, moving towards electrified vehicles, and then working to put charging stations out. So currently, the availability of charging stations is mostly in higher income areas. If you make those available for people, it makes it an easier job for them, makes them available and able to use electric vehicles, so that pretty much across society, regardless of income, you can use that charging infrastructure.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, going off of that, I also feel it's very important that going back to that shift in thinking on how we deal with energy, what the new daily life looks like with renewable or alternative sources of energy, it starts with the government. It can start with the government, and I think not only incentivizing solar panels, incentivizing electric cars, as you were saying, by increasing the amount of charging stations, which is a great start, but I also think when governments build new buildings, for example, my school, we just built parking. We put overhangs over the parking area, and on top of those there are solar panels, which I thought was an amazing implementation, because when we decided to build something new, we added an element of sustainability to that. And I think doing that at a larger scale is what's really going to be important, because if all buildings start to be built with solar panels on top, or it becomes the new norm where you build a building and now there's a green space or a garden on the roof, or sidewalks and roads are painted white so that, to combat or to kind of off-balance the effects of global warming and increased temperatures, that's something that if it becomes the new norm in what urban planning and even planning in rural or any area is something that is really important.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I want to elaborate on what Bailey said. I believe that using more ways of public transportation that are that use renewable energy sources, like you were talking about the hydrogen, not using private airplanes all the time. They become a big issue when it comes to pollution. Also, like Kina said, making sure that if you don't have to use fossil fuels for something, don't use it. Implementing more solar panels and researching specific ways to combat the environmental effects that don't need to have detrimental effects on the planet.
I want to add to what Alden was saying about financing these projects and how much of a role money plays in this conversation. I think it's so important that we redirect subsidies to sustainable agriculture efforts. So things like subsidies to big dairy and meat industries, I think that needs to go towards lower food chain agriculture, and we need to subsidize not only sustainable agriculture, but also areas where, like for example, when we're talking about dairy and dairy alternatives, there's a lot of conversations about how almond milk or oat milk or whatever dairy alternative is expensive and it takes too much energy and water to produce. Dairy is also expensive, it's just being subsidized. So if we redirect some of that funding to more sustainable sources of food and sustainable agriculture, that's definitely one way that we can solve this problem.
Absolutely, yes. Another round of applause. I'm learning so much. And I'll add to this question too, because I'm inspired by all your answers. But I think community empowerment is huge. I think to the extent that local governments can activate youth and community members to be more civically engaged, whether that's through mini grants and having community members come together and start their own community resilience project, whether it's tree planting, community gardens, resilience centers, both in deciding and figuring out what services community members need to provide, partnering with community-based organizations. I think government is too elusive to this generation. It's not clear how to participate or where our voices are heard when we're asked. We get the surveys, we fill them out, and we don't know how the input is being used. So I just wanted to add that to this great panel. And last question as we wrap up, are you optimistic about the future based off of what you heard today?
I would like to say yes. I'm going to say yes. But I would say there are still a lot of doubts I have. There needs to be more than just what was said in this room. It's a culture shift. It's a societal shift. And we have to adapt to that. We have to have some type of leadership to help us adapt to it, because we cannot individually do it on our own. So my answer is going to be yes, with some doubts.
I'm going to say yes, because if I have to do this for 50 more years not being positive, I don't know if I'm going to make it. And I get to see people like the ones on this panel working really hard and the people in this room. So.
I'm optimistic about our future, especially after hearing all the amazing progress we're making. But I think the only way that it's going to really make an impact is, like Bailey said, is if it becomes an entire societal, something that society as a whole identifies as something that we need to work on, something that we need to shift our thinking towards, and that we need to take action for. But I'm optimistic seeing how we are starting projects, how we are starting to make change, and we are making progress in this area. So hopefully that continues.
I am definitely more optimistic now that I've come here and listened to everyone speak. I think that it's nice to know that people want to focus not only on the immediate future, but also on maximizing our potential. So that has very much raised my optimism for the future, which is nice.
I'm definitely optimistic. I think that if we put our heads together and we really concentrate on this issue, that we can really solve any problem that comes our way. On a global scale, countries all over the world work together to help repair the ozone layer, and that's something that's definitely making so much progress in not just presently, but in the future. And again, in this room, we've already seen how much work is going into sustainability and sustainable practices for the future, and just the people in this room are already a great indication of where we're headed as a society. And finally, because we have so many young people that are motivated about climate change, not just us, but so many of our peers that are energy conscious and are environmentally conscious that are entering the workforce, I have no doubt that we have people that are motivated, people that care, and people that are going to work to make the world a better place. And I'm very optimistic about the future. I definitely think that we have what it takes.
Well, I think I'm not alone in thinking that we are all a little bit more optimistic after hearing these youth voices today. So let's give the panel one more big round of applause. Great job, guys.